Stop the train! Okay, I've got some bad news for you. We're not going to Transylvania. That's not what this podcast is going to be about. Because, well, quite frankly, it's a bit outside of my budget. This is a project for a college class. But also, it's not what I want to take a look at. See, people like Curti, Boya, Van de Vijveren, and Brubaker have already spent so much time and expertise examining this one region that I don't think I could have contributed anything more than they could have. But also, their expertise is limited to this one area, and I'm interested in the phenomenon that we're taking a look at, the way that nationalists think about their own history, in general, on the whole, across the world. And because this research requires being an expert in one specific country's history, knowing its language or languages, it means that much of the stuff you find out there is just going to show you one example. And I want to take a look at how these types of narratives compare, how they measure up to one another. Now, maybe it's just because I'm a history postgrad thinking about why one should even study history and what kind of a difference it makes to the world, but I think that this is the most clear-cut example of history having a real-world, physical, psychological, intimate impact on people's lives. So that's what this podcast is going to be. We're going to look at the history of writing history itself, the historiography, and how it relates to ethnicity, and most of all, nationalism. Because there's a difference between those two. If I go to consult my freshman Intro to Political Science handbook, this one's written by Andrew Heywood, an ethnic group is defined as, quote, a group of people who share a common cultural and historical identity, typically linked to a belief in common descent, end quote. A nation, on the other hand, is described in kind of the same way. Quote, a nation is a group of people bound together by a common language, religion, history, and traditions, although nations exhibit various levels of cultural heterogeneity. End quote. Well, last point makes sense, and may I add, it would probably be more appropriate to say that they could be bound together by a common language, religion, history, or traditions. Because from what I've learned, you don't need all of the above to feel like you're a nation. But still, it feels like they're basically saying the same thing twice. And this is where a crucial difference comes into play. Quote, a nation perceives itself to be a distinctive political community. End quote. In other words, nations are, let's call them communities, which want to engage in politics as a group. Often this presents itself as wanting their own state, but it doesn't have to be that way. Some nations just want autonomy for themselves within a larger state, or some other kind of political framework or system for themselves. An ethnic group doesn't necessarily have political ambitions. One could say that nations are ethnic groups who also want to have some form of say in politics. Now, there's one point I disagree with Heywood on. He says that both are groups which can be measured according to some objective principles. But once you start listing them, you get into the problem that I just described earlier. Does it have to be about language, about religion, common history or ancestry, or all of the above? I can think of cases in which any number of these factors, in different constellations, are what make a group of people think of themselves as a community. And that is the crucial point here. This is about people thinking they're a part of a community. The political scientist and historian Benedict pointed out that if you think you are part of a nation, then you think you belong to this community of individuals, but it's impossible for you to have met all of these individuals. Anderson says that we should therefore call nations imagined communities. He even called the book he wrote on it that, and it's become very well regarded. Now, that's not to say that he thinks nationalism is invented, or that I believe nationalism is invented, that it's not real in some way. Anderson says that all communities that are larger than, a village are imagined. And I would argue the fact that they exist within people's minds is being as real as it gets. So these groups, ethnic groups and nations, exist because their members believe they exist. And what we saw last episode is that sense of being a community, or more specifically, what are the defining features of that community, who is and isn't a part of it, are constructed over time between the people who make up these communities. That's why so many academics refer to nations as both historical and social constructs. And that's what I want to take a look at. If we understand that nations are historical and social constructs, what does that mean? How are they constructed? Who can construct them? And what happens when people disagree of what their nation is, or what other people's nations are? There's another thing I want to point out here, though. The title of this podcast is Whose Land is This Land? Last episode, I introduced it as a question, saying it was one of the oldest questions humanity has asked itself, that it has been asked by humans since before words were ever written down on a piece of paper, since before the first king climbed upon the first throne, since before the first crops were planted and the first houses were built. I'd been planning to say that at the start of every episode. And, well, it's all true. But what we're looking at is not that question. It's a very specific answer to that question. See, Anderson found in his book on nationalism that, relatively speaking, it's a new phenomenon. In fact, he traces the emergence of nationalism to a specific point in time, around 200 years ago. At that point, a number of different factors were coming together that made imagining political communities at the level of an ethnic group possible. The importance of religion was declining, but because religion had been important, languages had been standardized, so books about religion could be printed in them, as well as monarchs wanting to more easily administer their countries, and therefore standardizing languages to rule through them. And, ever since the French Revolution, there was a new idea in town for how to organize politics. Give power to the people. Now, Anderson's theories are really interesting, and although I'm not convinced that he explains all the aspects of this phenomenon accurately, the main thing I want you to take away from this is that I was wrong. And I'm going to have to change the intro to my podcast now. Because this podcast isn't about one of the oldest questions humanity has ever asked itself. It's not about the question of who should rule the state. It's about a new answer to this old question, that states should be ruled by the people, more specifically, a people who already think that they are part of a community. And so that's going to be what you hear going forward at the beginning of each episode. One last thing I also want to mention, for full disclosure's sake, I didn't make this podcast alone. This was done as part of a class at the University of Vienna, and I worked on this with a group of classmates. Ian Jones, Caroline Lebzelter, Tobias Hübel, Jasmine Rippinger, and Susanne Schmalwieser. Actually, we made 2 podcasts as a group. Susie's one is called Country and Fragments, and it's all about Austrian identity. So, if you're interested in even more construction of national identities, you should definitely check that one out. But shameless advertising aside, I want to sincerely thank each and every one of them. They were the ones who researched and wrote the episodes you're about to listen to. I couldn't have done it without you guys. Also, I want to thank Andrew Holt for designing the amazing artwork for this show, and Matthias Cantini for making our intro and outro music. And lastly, of course, Professor John Giepfried, without whom we'd never been able to get college credits for making this podcast. I hope you enjoy it.